Good evening and welcome to Tsaá with Roma. Tonight, I am with one of the greatest editors, I think, of my generation, Kate Simpson. You are Kate. You have to be proud. Kate Simpson is an award winning editor, poet, critic, and researcher, and she's writing through the sixth mass extinction. She's currently based in New York. She edited eco poetry collections for Faber, Valley Press, and New Writing North. She has recently edited the this anthology, Out of Time, Poetry from the Climate Emergency, which was described by Sally Carruthers of the Poetry School as a transcendent articulations of the limitless miracles of nature and conversely damning records of humanity's greatest shame. Good evening, Kate, and welcome to Tsaá with Roma.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
I'm wondering if you could treat us first to maybe one of the poems in the anthology, if you'd like to read one of them.
Oh my goodness, how to choose? I mean, do I pick yours?
No, don't pick mine. Mine's too long. Pick something that pick something that, while you were editing the anthology really resonated with you.
Probably the poems that I started with and ended with stuck out. So I might end on kind of a, I don't know, a hopeful note. So maybe I will read the last poem.
Yes.
Which is Leaf by Sean Hewitt. So, Leaf. For woods are forms of grief grown from the earth, for they creak with the weight of it. For each tree is an altar to time, for the oak whose every knot guards a hushed symbol of water, for how the silver water holds the heavens in its eye, for the axle tree of heaven and the sleeping coil of wind, and the moon keeping watch, for how each leaf traps light as it falls. For even in the night time of life, it is worth living just to hold it.
Wow. That poem is so beautiful. There's a real sense of focus there. And again, that experience of growth or regrowth.
And I think there's a really interesting and sort of poignant concept and emotion that kind of gets forgotten. It's almost like the concept of the language animal, not necessarily human or non-human or both, but the kind of the act of living and its intrinsic value beyond some of the value systems I think that we place certainly where we live on our kind of world today, and the kind of value systems of whatever that might be, kind of financial, technological, professional. And I think just the kind of the activism of just living and
yes. Yeah, I think you really hit the chord there when you said intrinsic value, that innate value, isn't it, beyond what we put on them. Tell us a little bit about the creation of this anthology. What does it mean for you to have it out in the world now?
Yeah, so I think it had kind of, the ideas had been sort of manifesting for it over, I suppose, the course of a couple of years. And I think I knew that I wanted to kind of make, in a way, a bit of a sort of manifesto and a research-based publication that spoke to how language and sort of literature and the syntactical systems can play into the way that we perceive the climate crisis and extinction. And I'd kind of researched and wrote around this. And I thought that the anthology form was an interesting one for kind of seeing it in action, because it allows for a kind of plethora of voices, and it allows for, you know, different perspectives. And kind of crucially, I think for this, perspectives from poets that would gravitate towards this kind of writing, and poets that wouldn't. And I was kind of keen to invite a range of voices across that, so kind of emerging and established, but also poets that would actively say that they were an eco-poet and ones that wouldn't, and so that kind of had work in this area already or not. And so I was kind of, I was musing on how basically poetry and its systems can offer something by way of pushing beyond the kind of consciousness and the vocabularies and the kind of systems that we use to speak to and of the environment now. And so I think the anthology kind of put that into practice. So I kind of had those thoughts, and then lockdown happened, and I was like, this is the kind of perfect time. So in a kind of timely element, that's how that came together. And then also thinking about how it might not only make a kind of manifesto for this kind of work, or to kind of demonstrate what it can do, but then to kind of actively contribute as well. So it kind of tied into the 50th anniversary of Friends of the Earth. So that kind of came at the same time in the year, because I wanted it to have a kind of footprint and a date stamp in that way. Because I quite often get asked the question, what can poetry do, which I'm sure we'll get onto. So it kind of came paired with that, and I kind of communicated with Friends of the Earth about wanting to do this anthology and wanting to come up with different responses, and responses that were varied in their kind of emotional content and the subject matter.
I think you're saying something really interesting about how language can be pushed to really reflect what's going on now, but also to reflect the innate language of nature. And you mentioned about multiplicity of voices, and I wonder if that's also the reason, or maybe if that also influenced you from sectioning the anthology into different sections. So you have parts here that focuses on the theme of emergency, grief, transformation, work, rewilding. Why is it important for you to determine which poems fall in which section? Is there some sort of focus that you want to create or magnify in this anthology?
Yeah, the sort of it's a kind of short and long answer question, I think, because I'd kind of redrafted and re-selected and re-sequenced the anthology many times. So the version that exists now, actually there were some quite radically different versions of it, where certain poems sat in radically different sections. So, and actually, to be fair, on rereading some of the poems, my understanding of them changed, and their kind of emotional intent in the way that it reached me did change. So then they kind of moved based on rereading and the kind of multiplicities that it offers upon rereading. So that's also interesting. It was kind of a real privilege to curate it, because it kind of helped me also to organize my thoughts around what poetry does and what eco-poetics does. But in terms of the kind of reasoning for the sections, it sort of comes from, first of all, with it tying into the 50th anniversary and there being 50 poets, there was, I think, this kind of idea that was rattling around in my mind to do with the precision of numbers, and the way that numbers reach us and the way that poetry reaches us, this kind of organization of information, and considering a lot of the climate metrics that reach us are all through numbers that are hard to understand, hard to ascertain. And so by almost giving a kind of grouping, giving it this kind of curation, this kind of sequence, and it's speaking to this relevance of numbers, but it's also, I think, was trying to make it manageable for readers in a way that speaks against climate nihilism or climate grief, or the kind of cognitive dissonance that we get when we think about these really vast numbers, the vast issues and the vast kind of interrelations of the crisis. So it was to kind of offer an emotional arc and a sequence in a way that led the reader through a kind of journey of emotions relating to the crisis, and to kind of offer some sort of order so that it doesn't leave the reader feeling like this is an insurmountable problem that I can never make sense of in any way, shape or form, and therefore we won't try and tackle it. So it's giving it some kind of shape to help, you think cognitively make sense of some of it.
We want this to have that emotional arc, but also there's practicality to it. We want the readers to be able to contain the poems while they're reading them, but also follow that emotional arc. Poets are often called people of witness, people of transformation. What kind of witness and transformation do you want the readers to gain from reading this anthology?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It makes me think about that Roger Robinson quote where he says the poet's job is to translate unspeakable things on the page, and the idea of, I suppose, the poet as witness, to that and to that transformation. So I mean, I think the anthology, as with the poem, it can't do everything. It can't, it's still a published form that has limitations, because it is a tangible object that has been created. It has an endpoint. It doesn't keep on going and going and going. So it, it can't speak to all languages and cultures, though I wish there was a way that it could. But I suppose in terms of the transformation for the reader, I think it's almost being able to look at the issue for long enough and to kind of concentrate the imagination upon some of the mechanisms of the crisis and some of the mechanisms of the issues, and to kind of maintain that attention, whether that be emotionally connecting something or to recognizing a certain hierarchical colonial system that has governed and therefore created these issues. So I think in a way it's the transformation, it has its limits. So I don't think it can kind of these anthologies are going to radically change.
I think that's the power of poetry as well, because you did mention about being able to look at the issue long enough, and I think that's what a book is. Well, that's the magic of, I feel that that's the magic of the book, and that's the magic of poetry as well. When we are alone with those words or with a poem, we can really take it, maybe not to the point that we are actively changed by it, but somehow there are some reverberations or change in us. Good thing about nature, our focus on nature, it's everywhere, isn't it? Especially nowadays, we're saturated in it, in the news, in political agendas and political campaigns. But there's also something that's happening when a reader sits with herself and with the word. And I feel that that's the effect of the anthology. Those little images or little words still reverberate in me. It makes me think about, when I walk in the woods, I think of this line and how true it is. That poem that you read a while ago, Sean Hewitt's poem, I still think about it when I'm alone in the woods. I wanted to focus as well, give a sort of focus and maybe not just focus, but respectful honoring to the little things that we see.
There's, a power in the kind of like a radical discomfort in some of the poems, the kind of, looking at things head on, and also considering empathy and what that means. And, if there's some kind of, as you say, the kind of small like thought pattern change, or something, a line that stays with you, or a word that stays with you, or even a sequence change. I think sequencing plays a really big role in all poetry books and collections, and the kind of movements from one poem to another. I think they're really important. And even the kind of recognizing connections across poems and recognizing, you know, some kind of common ground, be it an image or be it a kind of metrical system that somehow stays with you, that kind of resonance from one poem to the next, or there's some kind of act paying attention and really kind of focusing in on the line, the stanza, the word, the particular subject. And I think there's quite a lot to be said for a kind of radical activism in the poet line, the poet. Where am I? What am I trying to say? In a radical activism in the line of a poem. Sorry, COVID. Because it focuses. There are no words in that line that don't belong. They all have a purpose within the kind of system and the machine of the line in the poem. Even a transformation of paying attention and of really focusing in and kind of drowning out all the volume of the world and all the noise and all the information we're constantly attacked with and pressed with. It's the kind of radical thought of just concentrating inwards and focusing on that thing, that form.
Yes, definitely. And it makes me think, and the way you just describe it, it makes me think, and we're going towards the topic of craft, but it makes me think as a poem itself, how it is its own ecosystem, really. Everything is there for a reason, and everything is naturally there. And since we are staying in that topic of poetic craft, let's talk a little bit about what is an eco poem.
Firstly, I think it's the definition or the title of eco poetry, I think, is something that still needs to be unpacked. Because first of all, kind of inherently, all poetry is about ecology and about the world that we live in. And I think it's not divisible. We are not divisible from nature, and nature is an odd word that somehow seems kind of separate and something we need to reconnect to, but we are intrinsically part of it and changing it, and we have to take kind of responsibility for understanding the interconnection. So I would argue that all poems are ecological and all writing is ecological, because it can't not be. And kind of connected to that, I think eco poetry, in the respect of what we're talking about, has existed in many languages and cultures before we've, in the English language, kind of tacked on to this idea of kind of interconnectivity. So it has existed, but in this form, I think, in the context in which we're speaking in this kind of eco poetry in the English language, speaking now and kind of speaking to the crisis that we're living in now, I think eco poetry is different from, kind of distinguishes itself from nature writing, beyond just taking natural subject matter and kind of vocabulary, but it almost separates itself, I think, from how nature poetry can be quite voyeuristic, and it's almost this separation of, even if you're celebrating the natural world and you're celebrating its beauty, it's still a kind of step away from, in the way that the human event of it and the kind of spectacle of nature implies a separation. So I think really successful eco poetry challenges that notion and tries to decenter the lyric eye, so that the human event of the poem isn't there. It's kind of the hierarchy of the speaker is being taken away, and it also kind of speaks to an interconnectivity and an interrelation, and kind of questioning the systems that govern our world. So really kind of doing work through language that asserts a different view, a different perspective on the kind of orders that we set ourselves. So, whether that's taking the human event out of the poem altogether and the world is existing without it, or whether it's actively speaking to a mass carbon burning event. It doesn't have to. I think it doesn't have to be about the subject matter. It can be in the kind of quietude of an intimate trying to understand a different mode of communication that plants have that we don't speak to, or thinking of poems in the anthology. There's a poem by Matt Howard, which is in the work section, where every line starts with the kind of present participle verb to I'm trying to think of the actual poem now, but effectively kind of to till to work, and there's a sense of movement and a sense of work and the verb that happens, which implies the need for the work to be done on our part. So long story short, I think, what is an eco poem is a great thing to dig into for a whole, and I think I will spend my life probably thinking about that. I think quite a lot of what eco poetry does is it tries to question or break down the sort of anthropocentric perspective, whereby we're kind of at the top of this, pyramid, and whereby the speaker is the kind of main point of interest. They're the main event as to what they're seeing or what they're experiencing. And I'm really interested in the way that how we can perceive or speak to the world whilst we're never going to have a perception outside of our own, and so we have to speak from that, and we at points need to use, I think, anthropomorphism as a tool to find common ground and to find empathy in the senses or in a description of something other than us, other than, in the non-human world. Sometimes we need that as a tool to understand or to empathize with, but I think, can we go further than that? Almost, how can we consider other modes of communication in a non-human way, and to try and think beyond our own perception, beyond our own senses, what kind of other modes of communication exist? And it's a really paradoxical thought, because we're so tied to our senses and we're so tied to our own perceptions, we're never going to see beyond that.
How do you do it, Kate? when you try to see things from beyond your perspective?
I know, I'm speaking in such ambiguous terms. Well, first of all, read. I think with any kind of poetic question to craft, you always need to return to reading. So, read poetry, read eco poets that work in this way: Jory Graham, Alice Oswald, Camille Dungy, Karen McCarthy Wolf. It goes on. And then, natural history as well. I think I read broadly outside of poetic echo chambers, and so kind of pull from other critical theory, natural history, recent scientific papers in climate journals beyond media. Though actually it is interesting to think about how media portrays the climate, because there's a lot that you can pull from and kind of interrogate in terms of the language structures that we use to discuss it. So there's a lot of inspiration, I think, that you can find from material that already exists and speaking to and against that. But because it's such a large, seemingly insurmountable issue, you're not, in one poem, you are not going to solve the climate crisis. You are not going to be able to speak about everything. So I think rather than going macro with it, I'd probably encourage to start micro, like we were talking about, start on the intimate scale and focus in. And you can kind of take this as far as possible. But if you really consider how everything that surrounds you is part of it, so, you know, maybe even focusing in on one object that surrounds you, like, where did this plant come from? What is its genus? Has it, you know, does it involve botanical colonialism to even exist in the UK anyway?
Mm-hmm.
Where, you know, was it a gifted, was it a shop? Like, where did it come from? And kind of really, you can kind of pull backwards from there and find quite a lot of inspiration in starting small, starting on the micro, and really focusing in. And like I suppose I kind of talked about the like activism of the line and the close attention, because the close attention is what we need to shift our kind of thinking towards things, to focus back in on this kind of radical empathy, kindness, discomfort. It comes from close attention. So I think, yeah, like starting small, try not to think of the climate crisis all caps, but to start by focusing in on that kind of close attention to what language does and how it can speak to everything in the living and non-living world.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's a great pleasure to have
you
you here on Tsaá. It's really nice to finally speak with you. I'm wondering, Kate, if you could also perhaps read us one more poem before we say goodbye to our audience.
Yes. I'll read Caroline Bird's morality play, which is wonderful, and speaks for itself, I think. So, morality play. She said, "I find it difficult to care about using plastic bags or burning diesel or eating vast quantities of beef, as I'm still not entirely convinced that any of this is real." I said, "You mean climate change?" She said, "No, the world. I'm not sure the world is real, which makes it really hard to give a shit about recycling." I said, "Oh." She said, "Because what am I recycling exactly? Pixels? Images from someone else's dream? What looks and feels like a plastic bottle is probably just a speck of data in a video game. Or a cookie." "A cookie? Oh, I don't know. Each cloud of pollution is probably just a shadow passing over the sleeping eyelid of the alien." "What alien?" "The alien whose dream we're in." "Then why care about anything?" I said. "Why care about children, or love, or what you put inside your body?" She looked at me like I'd lost the plot. "Love is essential to the alien's dream," she said. "It's how you win the game." "Are we in a game or a dream?" I said, flicking a fag butt out the window. "It's a high-stakes dream," she said. "A dream with a purpose. You can fail." "What's the prize? How do you win?" "For all we know, it could be recycling. Recycling could be the key to the whole game," I said. "It's not," she said. "You know it's not." I felt like one of us should shout the word morality around about now, but instead we fell into bed, tearing off each other's clothes like hamburger wrappers, making munching noises.
Wow, beautiful poem and beautiful reading. Thank you so much, Kate.